of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, Bondi brings the heat. Attorney General Pam Bondi clashing with Democratic lawmakers in a marathon Capitol Hill hearing over the Epstein files. As tempers flared, Bondi pivoted to the Dow.
The Dow is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing. You're a great stock trader, as I hear, Raskin. What does a Dow have to do with anything? That's what they just asked. Are you kidding?
Mr. Jordan, Mr. Jordan?
We'll stay on the fallout from the files coming up this hour.
And Netanyahu at the White House. President Trump and Israel's prime minister meet behind closed doors for 3 hours on deal talks with Iran. Trump says it was a good meeting, but no agreements were made.
Plus, boots on the ground. Energy Secretary Chris Wright is in Venezuela. The first visit since Maduro's capture. His mission, jump-starting an overhaul of the country's oil industry. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern is along for the ride in Caracas and joins us later this hour with more.
And the drone wars. The FAA abruptly shuts down, then reopens airspace over El Paso Wednesday. The reason? A cartel drone incursion, according to the Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy. But lawmakers are demanding more clarity, citing conflicting accounts surrounding the sudden closure.
We begin this evening with a busy day here in Washington. The House on the verge of taking up a Democratic-led bill that would terminate the president's tariffs on Canada. This is just about to unfold. While in the Senate, Majority Leader John Thune reportedly says he expects the White House's counteroffer on Homeland Security funding and ICE restrictions today, as the clock ticks down to a partial government shutdown just days from now. But it's the president's closed-door meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that kicks off our coverage this evening, with the president saying that he told Netanyahu he intends to press ahead with talks with Iran. This was Netanyahu's 7th visit to the White House in President Trump's second term. For details on that bilateral meeting, we go to Bloomberg's Kathryn Lucey, who's with us live from the North Lawn at the White House. Kathryn, reporters were not allowed in the room for this meeting. In fact, we didn't even see Netanyahu going through the entrance of the West Wing. What do we make of that? And what do we know that they discussed?
That's right. Obviously, I'm here at the White House today. We did not see Netanyahu enter the building, which often you do when a world leader comes to the White House. Reporters also were not brought into the meeting, which during this Trump term, we've seen a lot of sort of impromptu press conferences with other world leaders. Obviously, that didn't happen today. It's clear from the president, that he's saying that this was a good meeting, but that he wants to continue talks to see if he can reach some kind of deal with Iran. And I think we know from talking to folks around the prime minister and from our reporting there that there is concern on that side about what such a deal could look like, and that's, I think, certainly part of the reason he was here. There's concern about what kind of deal President Trump might agree to, what the scope of that would be. But clearly, nothing decided today, but a very long time between these two leaders, talking about some of these issues.
Well, and as we consider the other issues that often capture the president's attention, Kathryn, we know his economic policy, specifically his tariff policy, is often one of them. And that is going to be on the spotlight, or in the spotlight on Capitol Hill this evening. A vote is expected on specifically a resolution condemning his 25% tariffs on Canada. How many Republicans is the White House potentially expecting to break with them?
I think we'll have to see how this plays out. Certainly there's a handful, that could join with Democrats here. I think the thing we need to, remember and think about with this vote is obviously it is symbolic in a way, but the context really is about the midterm elections. Democrats are making cost of living and affordability key issues going to this election, and they think that forcing these votes and raising questions about tariffs is part of that argument, and that is a sensitivity for this White House. That said, even as the White House tries to think about ways to, talk about cost of living, address affordability, I would not expect that the president is going to do much to change his tariff agenda. That has been a really huge piece of his economic program so far. He's been very vocal that he sees this as important to move forward with.
All right, Bloomberg's Kathryn Lucey reporting from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. And now joining us live from Capitol Hill for more is Congressman Pete Aguilar of California, chair of the House Democratic Caucus. Congressman, thank you so much for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. As we look ahead to the vote expected just a short time from now, have you heard from your Republican colleagues about just how many of them are willing to vote with your caucus on this one?
I haven't, but the important thing here is that we have an opportunity to vote. We have an opportunity in the House here this afternoon, just like the Senate has had in the past, to exercise our disapproval of these tariffs that Donald Trump levied onto Canada. These tariffs are costing Americans thousands of dollars. The average household is paying thousands of dollars more as a result of the tariffs and the big ugly law combined. That's just the reality that Americans are facing, and they are feeling this affordability crunch come their way. In every corner of every community, that's felt. And as elected officials, we should have an opportunity to voice our feelings on those tariffs. And my Republican colleagues, if they vote no, then they are accepting, then they are supporting these tariffs and the rising costs that people are facing.
Mr. Chairman, it's good to have you back. I'm wondering what the Democratic Party does, what your conversations with your fellow leaders include here for how to handle this opportunity. Now that the gates are open, we understand it's the Meeks bill on Canada tonight. Do you have a war room set up? Is there a map on the wall? Will each member get a different country as this goes forward? A daily vote, a weekly vote? What should we expect?
Well, you should expect that Congress should work its will. We should have an opportunity to voice our displeasure about these tariffs. Each of them is different, and the president wrote them all differently. We should have an opportunity to voice whether we support these tariffs or not in each jurisdiction. Yeah. Mexico, Brazil, other countries. That's all fair. This isn't about political opportunities or points. This is about demonstrating our ability, respecting Article 1 of the Constitution, and standing up and being able to say on behalf of our constituents, that's a policy I support or that's a policy I don't support. Democrats have said loud and clear that these tariffs aren't being done appropriately or effectively, and the Supreme Court might have something to say about that as well in the future. But in the meantime, that shouldn't stop us from debating and discussing and voting on this.
Well, to your point, Congressman, why not just leave it up to the Supreme Court to say something definitively? Why can't you wait for that moment?
Well, we have been waiting for that. It was Speaker Johnson, actually, who turned off our ability to address this. We would have liked to do this well before the courts heard this case. We would have chosen to do this in real time to demonstrate our view once the president enacted these tariffs. It's only because of Speaker Johnson and House Republicans that we in the House didn't have an opportunity to do that. This isn't something Leader Thune did. Leader Thune let the Senate vote on this. What we're asking is, why can't we have that same opportunity to voice our feelings from our constituents about these tariffs and the rising costs that it will lead to?
This vote tonight is coming against the backdrop of a countdown to another partial shutdown here. As you well know, Congressman, end of the day Friday, Department of Homeland Security runs out of money. We understand that there could be a counteroffer. John Thune says something on paper, presumably with details that could be included in legislation. Have you seen that counteroffer? Do you expect that tonight?
All I know is the public reporting that's indicated that Senator Thune has said that it's coming. I haven't seen any details. Democrats put out our offer last week. We put out legislative text days ago as well. Our view is very simple. ICE and CBP should operate just like other law enforcement agencies around the country. They should have body cameras. They should have accountability. They shouldn't be using taxpayer dollars to terrorize our communities. That doesn't seem like a heavy lift. We feel that that is important, and that's what we have been advocating. If the White House has different thoughts and they have legislative language, it would be helpful if they shared that with us. We're hours away from a shutdown, so the clock is ticking here. But unfortunately, I don't believe that this is going to be a serious offer from them that we can take up.
Well, so that said, and we've talked to a number of Republican lawmakers in the past couple of days who say unmasking alone is a deal breaker. Sounds like DHS is shutting down. Are appropriators making efforts to strip ICE away from the Coast Guard, FEMA, and from the TSA, so this shutdown doesn't hamper air traffic, for instance, or disaster response? Or are you prepared to let this go for a couple of weeks? We understand TSA wouldn't miss a paycheck till March.
Rosa DeLauro, the lead Democrat in the Appropriations Committee, just this morning put out a language that would do exactly that. I would encourage my Republican colleagues to think about that. It would ensure that we have continuous operations for FEMA, the Coast Guard, TSA, Secret Service, CISA, cybersecurity, all of these agencies that are engaged in actual homeland security. Those should be funded through the continuation, through the remainder of the fiscal year. But ICE and CBP and the Secretary's office, we have huge concerns about their leadership, about their direction, and about their continuous terrorizing of our communities. And that's something that we should continue to have disagreements about and work through. And if our Republican colleagues meet with us about that, then that's something we can talk about. But that doesn't mean that we should have these other entities within government lapse in funding. Rosa DeLauro put out a bill that would do just that. I haven't heard anything from our Republican colleagues about it.
Well, what incentive would they have to deal with Democrats on that, Congressman? If you lose the leverage of the other portions of the Department of Homeland Security that would lose funding, knowing ICE was funded, provided ample funding in the One Big Beautiful Bill, does that not work against Democrats if you do those carve-outs to keep the other parts of DHS funded?
$75 billion for ICE in the One Big Ugly Bill that you referenced. So we understand that's 7 times the ICE budget. The president would have the ability likely to declare that they need to continue operating, but they can use other funding. They can use that one-time funding. I am not going to offer my vote for ICE and CBP to continue the status quo that allows them to terrorize communities, to beat down doors, to rip people out of cars, and to shoot U.S. citizens. I'm just not going to do it, and my colleagues aren't going to do it either. And so we can continue to have that discussion about having real accountability to these agencies that mirrors every other law enforcement agency in this country. We can continue to have that fight, and we should, while allowing the other pieces of Department of Homeland Security to continue. If my Republican colleagues choose to shut down Homeland Security, then they're choosing that path. They're choosing to shut down TSA. They're choosing air traffic control disruption, and they're choosing lapsing funding for the Coast Guard.
We've walked our way through a couple of issues, Congressman, and haven't yet mentioned Jeffrey Epstein. There was quite a doozy of a hearing today that we saw Attorney General Pam Bondi with her some pretty tough questions about the way the DOJ is handling this. She also came forth with a pretty aggressive presentation herself. If nothing happens in the pursuit of criminal charges against those who have been outed in the Epstein files before the midterms, if Democrats take power in the House, what do you plan to do? What hearings will we see? What actions will your party take?
Look, this is about accountability and finding the truth. That's what oversight Democrats have been talking about. That's what our efforts to lead the discharge petition and to pass the law that ultimately the president signed that allows for the release of this material. Now the Department of Justice is redacting a huge portion of that. We believe that that's wrong, and we would unseal that or reduce the number of redactions within those documents. But this is about providing oversight and accountability, justice for these victims. Democrats will continue to seek justice on behalf of the victims, whether we're in the minority or we're in the majority. That work will continue. The president can choose, and the Department of Justice can choose to go along and to follow the law, or they can be subject to us bringing them in and asking them questions about it. It's their decision.
I have one more question for you, Congressman, pertaining to the Department of Justice. As we understand, the DOJ sought but did not get an indictment by a grand jury of the 6 of your colleagues, Democratic colleagues, who put out that video encouraging members of the military not to follow unlawful orders, Congressman. And I wonder what your response is to that knowledge that, yes, they asked for it, though the grand jury did not give it to them.
This is just another case of the Department of Justice being weaponized against people who disagree with the President of the United States. The President of the United States tweets out that he doesn't like this video that members put out, members of the House and Senate who have served our country, by the way, all members who have served this country in uniform. He doesn't like it, and so they have his back, and they seat indictments now for these members. It's very hard to believe, and let me put these two issues together that you brought. It's very hard to believe that the White House is exercising good faith negotiations to avoid a lapse in funding for the Department of Homeland Security, while at the same time the White House's Department of Justice is trying to indict 6 members of Congress. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Thankfully, again, the grand jury has turned back what the Department of Justice has brought to them. This is not the first or the second or the third or even the 5th time that has happened. Grand juries across this country have said no to the Department of Justice because they are trying to weaponize the law against people who disagree with them. It shouldn't be done. It shouldn't be happening. More Republicans should be speaking out against it. And in the meantime, we just hear crickets. So it's incredibly unfortunate, but that's the state of play, and that's what you have when an administration and when the president tries to use his own Department of Justice to go after his political opponents. But this isn't the first time, and I'm going to venture to say it won't be the last time that he does it.
He's chair of the House Democratic Conference, Congressman Pete Aguilar of California. It's great to have you back, sir. Thanks for joining us this evening on Bloomberg. Coming up, Jobs Wednesday, delayed because of the last government shutdown. Yeah, the January jobs report was out today and showing much stronger than expected hiring, but also huge downward revisions. We'll dive into the details behind the numbers coming up with economic policy consultant Kathryn Edwards. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. A focus on affordability helped McDonald's grow sales at the fastest pace in more than 2 years last quarter. Company posting stronger than expected sales and earnings in an after-hours session that also includes quarterly results from Cisco Systems and AppLovin. For details, we turn to Power Moves now with Bloomberg's Alexandra Semenova, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Alexandra?
Hey, Joe, certainly a busy earnings season continues with a number of reports hitting the tape after the close. You just mentioned McDonald's, a big bellwether of the U.S. consumer. Their sales grew at the fastest pace in more than 2 years in the fourth quarter. This came as value meals continued to resonate with cost-conscious consumers as they still feel the pinch of inflation. Sales from established U.S. restaurants jumped 6.8% from the same period a year ago. That was back when foot traffic was dented by an E. coli outbreak. Earnings, excluding one-time write-offs, also outpaced the average analyst estimates. Then turning over to tech, Cisco Systems, the largest maker of machines that run computer networks and the internet, it delivered a positive outlook for the current quarter, signaling that the company is attracting customers related to the build-out of its AI systems. The company estimates revenue will come in up to $15.6 billion in the period that runs through April. That topped the average analyst estimates on Wall Street. CEO Chuck Robbins said that Cisco is uniquely positioned to deliver the trusted infrastructure needed to securely and confidently power the AI era. And finally, AppLovin, that is the mobile technology marketing firm. Those shares are sliding in extended trading as many of the key metrics topped analyst estimates. Their results stoked concerns that they may not be strong enough to weather AI disruption. It sees total revenue of up to $1.78 billion in the first quarter. That was above the estimate of $1.7 billion. So very high bar for a lot of these reports, Joe.
Well, and Alexandra, as we follow earnings season, there, of course, is other macro stories happening simultaneously, as this was a jobs report Wednesday, delayed, of course, due to the government shutdown. Talk us through the market reaction to the stronger than expected data we saw.
Yeah, Kayla, it was a really eventful day in the equity market specifically. We saw a lot of back and forth trading from the American equity indexes, all for that to close with the S&P 500 flat on the day. The NASDAQ 100 managed to eke out a 0.3% gain, and the Dow was slightly lower. The jobs data did spur a slide in treasuries as investors recalibrated their expectations around how much the Fed will cut interest rates this year. Cryptocurrencies also extended their slump with Bitcoin below the 68,000 level. And within the equity market, the initial rally was pummeled by continued selling of software companies as investors worry about the impact that AI will have on certain industries. We also saw a rotation continue to take shape. So even though the S&P 500 was flat on the day, about 300 shares in the index were higher as investors pour into some of the laggards of last year on expectations that the economy will continue to grow, even though the mega caps were lower, and an exchange-traded fund tracking software firms was down 3%. And the latest sector to get hit by fears that AI will disrupt their business models was real estate. A lot of those stocks were in focus late into the day. Companies like CBRE and Cushman & Wakefield posted their biggest drops since March 2020 during the pandemic.
All right, Bloomberg's Alexandra Semenova, thank you so much. And we'll have more on today's jobs report in just a moment. But first, we want to bring you live to Venezuela, where Energy Secretary Chris Wright landed just a few hours ago, meeting with the nation's new leader, Delcy Rodriguez, and set to assess its energy infrastructure. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern has been traveling with the secretary and is joining us live from Caracas. So, Annmarie, walk us through what you have seen Chris Wright do today.
It's an absolutely historic trip, Kaylee, especially when you consider that the U.S. shuttered its embassy here in 2019. And today, it almost felt surreal, waiting for Secretary Wright and acting President Delcy Rodriguez to come brief the press that an American flag was there outside the Miraflores Palace. So really, a change of tone and tenor for this relationship. And that's what the secretary talked about. He said he dined with the president last night, and the message that Trump wants to bring to Venezuela is that he wants to make the Americas great again, and he wants to, quote, transform this relationship. Secretary Wright talked about setting the Venezuelan people and economy free. He feels like this can be done with the immense, vast amounts of resources that are in this country, and not just oil, it's natural gas, it's mining as well, and electricity. And for Delcy Rodriguez, she was talking about a lot of these projects already started, but they need more capital and they need more infrastructure. This is a country that has very degraded infrastructure right now, and that is why it's the start of potentially growing business opportunities. Obviously, of course, we've heard from the business community, there is excitement, but there's also some trepidation about the stability of what is going on right now in the country. The two today really just spoke about the business opportunities, but I say it's historic because he is the most highest-ranking U.S. government official to step foot in Venezuela since the capturing of Nicolas Maduro at the start of the year. And on the ground, people are equating this hype to when the U.S. actually withdrew in 2019, and also the last time President Bill Clinton visited the country in 1997. Of course, that was the year before Hugo Chavez took over the country. So that is the feeling on the ground. Immense excitement, but also a lot of consternation as well.
With regard to the consternation, Annmarie, and it's great that you made your way down there on this important trip. I recall the commentary from the CEO of ExxonMobil, who called Venezuela uninvestable. How far can you go outside of Caracas without a major security detail? How safe is it in Venezuela?
Well, of course, this is a country that has a lot of issues with safety, security, and stability. And that is why these businesses want to see rule of law. They want to make sure that a capital investment is there. They want to make sure their creditors could be made whole and due. It is very challenging, obviously, to operate in a city like this. But we also heard from Delcy Rodriguez's brother this week, and they talked about rebuilding the infrastructure in the country to make it a more attractive place for capital investment. Now, those words from Darren Woods of ExxonMobil were really a huge bucket of cold water for this administration. But when I talk to the administration, they say behind the scenes, there is a lot of excitement. When it comes to the oil and gas industry, it might not be the big players like ExxonMobil, but the wildcatters continuously want to come here and reach out. I spoke to individuals that are on the ground here working the embassy, and they say they constantly get outreach. So there's a lot of excitement, and people want to be the first ones in. But there is that concern everyone asks, well, if I come down there, if I even visit, is it going to be safe? So it is a great point, and that is something why this meeting is so important, because both sides want to show that they are working together to bring stability. But honestly, time is going to tell.
Well, and when we consider time, Annmarie, how long would it realistically take for these assets to be online and for production capacity to actually be there, knowing this White House more immediately wants to be addressing questions around affordability, oil and gas prices included in that?
Yeah, so when it comes to an individual like Chevron, they've been operating in this country for a century, so they are already going to start expanding that production. But of course, they have boots on the ground, they have state-of-the-art facilities right here in the country, so they are in a position to do that, especially if they get an extended license from this administration. One thing that, of course, potentially was holding some companies back was the fact that this country was under immense sanctions. And you've already seen OPEC move on that slowly, but Secretary Wright spoke about that today, standing alongside Delcy Rodriguez. He spoke about the fact that what they are doing, and he said they are working 7 days a week in Washington to issue new licenses. Now, a lot of these licenses are going to come with some measures that individuals need to be wary of, or make sure that they are, dotting their T's and dotting their I's and crossing their T's. But they are issuing new licenses, so they want to move fast in that sense to get things started. But of course, if you want to invest in Venezuela as a huge company, it is a years-long, decades-long process.
And one will continue to follow at Bloomberg. Annmarie, well, specifically Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, live from Caracas, Venezuela. Thank you so much. And it's quite striking, if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, to see the images of Chris Wright shaking hands with Delcy Rodriguez, knowing there is still a question as to whether or for how long she will remain in leadership, or at what point there will be democratic elections once again in Venezuela.
Yeah, that was a Bloomberg camera that caught him coming down the stairs onto that tarmac. That was not a pool camera. There are not many reporters who were there alongside Annmarie, and remarkable just to see the images of driving around Caracas with so many questions about what's happening on the ground there. Leave it to Bloomberg to be on the cutting edge of this one, first back in the country, along with the secretary. Remarkable. Yeah, remarkable indeed. Of course, energy and oil, always something that we're following, just as we're always following the economy. And back here in Washington, President Trump was focused on that today as well, specifically celebrating a stronger than expected January jobs report. The revisions, another story, writing on True Social, quote, great jobs numbers, far greater than expected, going on to say the United States of America should be paying much less on its borrowings, and calling for the world's lowest interest rate. And joining us now with her view on that is Kathryn Edwards, economic policy consultant and Bloomberg opinion contributor. She's also the host of the new Optimist Economy podcast. Great to see you, Kathryn. I just wonder how both of the things the president was saying there can be true at the same time, that we have this great labor market, but also we need lower interest rates. Are both things true?
Well, I would nitpick and say that greater than expected is not great. And 130,000 jobs added in January of any year of the past 4 would not be considered a great jobs report. That's below average for jobs for the years excluding 2025. Now, 2025, we learned that there were roughly 500,000 fewer jobs, adding only 181,000 jobs for the year. It was the worst, I believe, since 2003, the worst non-recessionary year for the labor market. That's, I think, I would go back to saying greater than expected is not the same thing as great. And we have been, in some ways, held in labor market purgatory for the past 2 years. Will a recession come? Will the interest rates need to be lowered? Watching Fed activity. And I think what we got from this report is it wasn't as bad as it could be, and therefore we should be happy. But that's not the same thing as these are jobs for American workers. This is income for American households. This is the feeling that people can move jobs, can find new jobs. None of that was in the report today. We just didn't get something bad enough to wonder about interest rates.
Well, the president says the golden age is upon us. And if we learned today that there's a net, essentially zero increase in jobs from the first year, when do they show up? Do the benefits of the big, beautiful bill bring those jobs specifically for manufacturing this year?
Well, not if you have a year of manufacturing decline like we did last year. I mean, it's worth noting that 80,000 jobs added from this past month in January came from healthcare, which has been the source of job growth in the economy for the past year. What's troubling about that is healthcare and the growth in healthcare as an industry is not a reflection of the strength of the U.S. economy. I'm not learning when healthcare adds jobs in a month like this one. I'm not learning that healthcare has great access to credit, that healthcare feels confident about the next 12 months, that healthcare feels that they can make capital investments and expand, because it's not an industry that reflects economic activity or economic strength. It reflects that we have people that get sick, and a lot of them are old. I just worry that the focus that we've had for so many years on whether or not the U.S. will dip into recession has in some ways skewed our perspective of what makes a job report strong. And if you had given me this report 2 years ago, I would have looked at it and said something has gone seriously wrong from the month before. It's, I think, given the past year's weakness that we would herald the top number, the headline number, as good. But I'm not really seeing strength in the labor market that would translate to workers in a meaningful way, not unless they've got a job in healthcare.
Well, to your point about watching out for any recessionary signals here, a lot of that's going to depend on the consumption engine, right? If consumers are still willing to pour money to rev up the economy. So how much does it matter what kind of jobs and what kind of wages they pay are actually being added? Are we seeing high wage job growth anywhere that would propel that kind of spending that's needed to drive the economy?
Job growth for the year, or income growth for the year, wage growth from the year from this report showed it to be in line with the past, not enough to really beat the hangover of inflation from the years prior. I think the other part that you're getting at that worries me is that this is being accompanied by signals in the consumer market, things like, credit defaults getting at all-time highs. The balance, very high delinquencies. The balance sheets on credit cards are high. The amount that's being rolled over is high. I think if you just got the number 130,000, you would think this is good. But if you put it next to, net job growth from 2025, the number of other kind of indicators that are showing weakness in the household balance sheet, you can't exactly say to them, but the job market is roaring right now. I mean, a great example of this would be just how slow hiring is.
I wanted to ask you with the dual mandate if you're more worried about the job market or inflation, but maybe you're going to tell me that you need to wait until Friday. We've got a CPI report in a couple of days. What's it going to tell us?
I mean, I think it's going to tell us that we are continuing to not make progress back down to the target that was set. And what I worry about is that this, I think of it as like this economic purgatory that we have been held in for so long of waiting for either inflation or to the labor market to break is giving us, an acceptance of a substandard labor market that we shouldn't have. And unfortunately, for people who watch the Fed, interest rates are not the answer. It's not we talk a lot about what the Fed will do if they'll lower interest rates, if that can help juice the consumer market and juice the economy or help businesses expand. But we have fundamental weaknesses in our labor market that interest rates will simply not touch. It's very hard to say 130,000 jobs in January is good when 30 million people do not have a paid sick day, when there are still 1 million people earning $7.25 at a minimum wage that hasn't been raised in almost 16 years. So I think that the chamber that we get in is what will the Fed do? Trump is talking about the Fed lowering interest rates. We get this jobs report, we get the price report, and we get set on this path of assuming that interest rates are the salvation for the labor market when good labor policy is the salvation for the labor market. And that is what we are not talking about. How do we actually make jobs good and better in this country? That is not on Jerome Powell. That is on our Congress to pursue policies that raise the incomes of American workers.
Kathryn, it's great to have you with us in Washington. Good to see you in the studio. Kathryn Edwards, economic policy consultant and a Bloomberg opinion contributor. Find her online and on the terminal. Fireworks today on Capitol Hill after Attorney General Pam Bondi testified before the House Judiciary Committee for more than 5 hours. It was a marathon. Lawmakers grilling Bondi over the release of the Epstein files or lack thereof and her use of the Justice Department to target perceived political enemies of President Trump. Bondi sharing this heated exchange with Democratic Congressman Jerry Nadler of New York over her department's pursuit, or lack thereof, of legal action against Democrats. Take a listen.
How many perpetrators are you even investigating?
First, you showed it. I find it.
How many have you indicted?
Excuse me. I'm going to answer the question.
Answer my question.
No, I'm going to answer the question the way I want to answer the question.
No,
Your
you're going to
theatrics
answer the
are
question
ridiculous.
the way I asked it.
Chairman Jordan, I'm not going to get in the gutter with these people, but I'm going to answer the question.
How many have you indicted?
Again, the time belongs to
claiming my time.
The time belongs.
I think it's very interesting.
Claiming my time.
I think it's very interesting.
And you can reclaim your time.
He talks about they indicted. The president said they indicted him twice.
Mr. Chairman, please stop the clock and stop the clock and restore his time.
Okay, here we go with these theatrics.
Went on for over 5 hours like this. Joining us now with his reaction in this entire case. Ty Cobb, former special counsel to President Trump in the first administration, former federal prosecutor. Ty, it's great to see you. Welcome back. If the files are not being released on time, and they're not, redactions appear to be, in some cases, protecting the perpetrators and exposing the victims. Prosecutions apparently not being pursued. Is this a cover-up?
Oh, certainly it's a cover-up, Joe. I mean, all we have to do is go back to the promises early on to release all the Epstein files, her insistence that they were on her desk, her insistence that, along with Blanche, that they had all been reviewed and that there was really no more evidence to share, and that nobody else was implicated. And then, her pretense that they had actually produced what was required. And then, of course, we got the 3 million pages this week. I mean, all they have is lies and obfuscation, and of course the defiance and theater that we got today when she creates a mud pit, pulls people down into it, and then when asked why she's so dirty, pretends to be the victim. This is not since John Mitchell went to prison have we had an attorney general this reprehensible.
Well, that is certainly a strong sentiment, Ty. When we consider what went down in that hearing room and the various interactions, feisty, as you rightly point out, interactions she had with lawmakers, including Congressman Tom Massey, the Republican who actually played for her, sound of Kash Patel testifying in the Senate, being asked about whether or not there was adequate evidence there in these files to bring further charges against offenders. He said at the time no, and Massey went on to say that Kash Patel effectively lied under oath to Congress about that. Do you expect Kash Patel or Pam Bondi or anyone involved in this to ultimately, even if it's not during this administration, potentially have to answer for the way in which this has been conducted in the U.S. legal system?
So you would hope so. I mean, Nuremberg held the Nazi facilitators and perpetrators accountable. I doubt that we'll ever have a Nuremberg moment. I'd be content if they just tucked their tails between their legs and left. But you would hope that there would someday be accountability. But to get to accountability, we have to survive what's going on. And as Gary Kasparov said yesterday about this administration and their atrocities, this is not a drill. I mean, this is open warfare against our institutions, Congress, the other party, as they perceive it to be an enemy, and the American people. I mean, here we are, today, when asked if she could apologize to the victims for the horribly redacted materials they disclosed that protected the perpetrators, and the administration's friends and allies, but exposed victim information that should never have seen the light of day. Asked if she could apologize to the victims in the audience, she waved her hand. I mean, she doesn't care about the victims, and I don't think we're necessarily seeing the accountability. But it would be nice because they have really eviscerated the rule of law, drained the Department of experience and talent, and are unable to hire anybody other than a Trump loyalist, and that's actually all they're recruiting.
Well, you talk about open warfare, Ty Cobb. It's open warfare that now includes the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, ensnared in this whole story because his name showed up a lot more times than was expected in some of these files. And he had to answer for this yesterday and acknowledge the fact that he did continue some level of a relationship, even though he said it was not a close one, with Jeffrey Epstein years after he had first suggested and, in fact, visited the infamous island. Here's what he said in a hearing separate from the Attorney General yesterday.
We had lunch on the island. That is true, for an hour, and we left with all of my children, with my nannies and my wife, all together. We were on family vacation. We were not apart. To suggest there was anything untoward about that in 2012, I don't recall why we did it.
Does he need to recall why he did it? And what happens next? Did they subpoena his wife, children, and nannies?
No, but I mean, I think we should all be comforted by the fact, since he's the Commerce Secretary, that he could count his children and get them on the boat away from a man who had, at the time of this meeting, had been convicted 6 years earlier of being a pedophile. It's just shocking. And of course, this is Lutnick, who said, his last contact with Epstein was in 2005 after a visit to Epstein's townhouse in New York, which of course happened to be next door to Lutnick. Anybody who believes that they had a limited relationship is dreaming. And of course, the mention of him yesterday in the documents was so extensive. It also revealed a multi-million-dollar transaction that the two of them participated in as late as 2014, 9 years after Lutnick said that he'd had no further contact. So yes, it's distressing. He should definitely resign. And in any other administration, he would. I mean, in Britain, people who, merely vouched for somebody who had met with Epstein and denied any wrongdoing have resigned. So the standard in the United States is not what it once was. That's obviously why we have a president like Trump, a Secretary of Defense like Hegseth, RFK Jr., Bondi, Lutnick, Kash Patel, and others.
Well, and we should note Secretary Lutnick also denies any wrongdoing. There is no evidence of that. But Ty, in our final moment with you, I do want to ask for your reaction to a direct call out you received on Truth Social from President Trump. I believe we'll be able to pull that up on the screen for our audience on Bloomberg TV, but for the benefit of our audience on radio, it reads in part as follows. Ty Cobb, one of the worst lawyers in Washington, D.C., a real loser, was fired years ago because he was having lunch with another lawyer talking about one of my many cases while sitting next to two reporters from the failing New York Times, going on to say, I fired Ty Cobb because he was a whack job who I hardly knew, and he knew nothing about me. Your response, Ty?
So much as I'd love to respond, I feel guilty taking up any airtime, on myself when the number of atrocities out there committed by this president and the people who serve him is so extensive. I'm not going to defend myself. I'm not going to waste your precious air. But I will say this: the president seems to go after anybody who is a dissident, and as Gary Kasparov mentioned yesterday, it's dissident that will soon replace immigrants in the detention facilities that are being built at the cost of billions around the country.
All right, Ty, we appreciate you joining us. Ty Cobb, former special counsel to President Trump during the first administration. Thank you. Now, another story we're following, a turbulent morning in Texas as the FAA abruptly announced a 10-day closure of the airspace around El Paso, only to then quickly reopen it. The administration said that the closure was caused by unmanned aircraft activity from Mexican drug cartels, but the restrictions have since been lifted and all flights will resume as normal. Here to break it all down for us here in Washington in our bureau is Bloomberg's Michael Shepard. So, Mike, we heard that it was drug cartel activity, but we also understand there was a bit of a dispute between the FAA and the DOD around drones and lasers. Walk us through it.
Well, Kaylee, we are getting two different versions of the events that unfolded last night and into the morning today. And the official version was that, yes, there was some sort of interdiction activity undertaken by the Pentagon and the FAA against what they described as an incursion by drones flown by Mexican cartels over the border that were then neutralized, according to Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy. However, we have talked to sources, and it turns out that there is more to this. Apparently, the Pentagon was actually testing drones, flying drones near the El Paso airport, and then using a test high-energy laser technology to knock them down or neutralize them. And the fact that they were operating so close to the airport raised concerns in the FAA's minds about whether this was safe for civilian air traffic. Now, the agency and the Pentagon were supposed to have a conversation on February 20th, sources have told us, but the Pentagon went ahead with this testing ahead of that conversation, spurring this closure. Now, the closure raised a lot of questions also. After 9/11, airspace in the U.S. was closed for not even 3 days. They were talking about a 10-day closure here. So it raised a lot of questions, and we're hearing some calls for some explanation.
Sounds like it all could have been avoided with a simple conversation. Shep, thank you. Bloomberg's Michael Shepard in Washington. We'll be back with more Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And we are keeping a close eye, a live look at the House floor on Capitol Hill as we're expecting a vote in a series of votes that is happening this evening on President Trump's tariff policy, specifically when it comes to the 25% tariff on Canada. A resolution condemning that policy could hit the floor and could see a number of Republicans joining with Democrats potentially to vote for it after Speaker Johnson's maneuvering to try to avoid this whole scenario failed with 3 Republican defections last night. Joining us now with their reaction to this and more is this evening's political panel, Kristen Hahn, Democratic strategist and partner at Rock Solutions, alongside Bloomberg Politics contributor and Republican strategist Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. So, Rick, to begin with you as the Republican here, knowing that just 3 of them broke with the Speaker and Trump last night to try to ban votes on tariff policy in general until later on this summer, how many realistically do you think could be prepared to go against the president on this vote?
Yeah, it'll be interesting because the White House responded immediately with, a strategy that I thought looked just like trying to cut their losses, right? There's going to be a substantial amount of folks who break from our party on this Canadian tariff issue. And it doesn't really matter because they'd need 2/3 to override my veto. So all of this is for naught. So that's just an effort to try and minimize whatever impact they have. My guess is there won't be that many Republicans voting for the measure, but there'll be a lot of Republicans taking a walk on it. And that's a good way to sort of gauge whether or not, there's enough resistance to Donald Trump. Trump's probably right. White House is probably right. He's got a veto-proof majority there, even under these circumstances. So it's a great show, and it sends a message, certainly to those Republican members, to their constituents, but a lot of flash, but not a lot of substance.
Okay. Kristen, what's the Democratic plan here? What's the strategy? We talked to Pete Aguilar a short while ago. He didn't get too detailed with us, but I'm assuming that there's a table with a map on it here, and we're going to pinpoint what countries we're going to draft legislation to vote on. We're going to pick certain frontline members to put their names on it. Is this what the next couple of weeks looks like?
I think you are. I mean, you're going to see a lot of that. You're looking at states like Michigan, right? You've got that, that hot Democratic primary out there right now, but it's going to be a Senate race. So I think that there will be a cross between a Venn diagram of, policy and where the politics matter. And,
even though these will never become law. This is about...
They'll never become law because we're all waiting on the Supreme Court.
Forcing Republicans to vote.
But there's a lot in that, like forcing them to take this vote and seeing where they land on this. Now, some of them have already taken the tough vote. So in a lot of ways, I think that's already happened. But, the Democrats are going to continue to be very direct and calculated about which countries they're going to talk about, Canada, Mexico, things that directly impact our border states.
Well, as we consider what's happening on Capitol Hill and what's happening at the border, of course, there's also the question around arrests that are being made for people in the country illegally. That, in part, was the subject of testimony from the Attorney General Pam Bondi today in the House, which got very testy at times over a number of issues, including that of Jeffrey Epstein, but also touched on, or at least the Attorney General touched on, the stock market specifically. Just take a listen to what she had to say.
The Dow is over 50,000 right now. The S&P at almost 7,000. And the NASDAQ smashing records. Americans' 401ks and retirement savings are booming. That's what we should be talking about. We should be talking about making Americans safe. We should be talking about, what does a Dow have to do with anything? That's what they just asked. Are you kidding?
Rick, what does the Dow have to do with the Attorney General?
Well, if she were the Secretary of the Treasury, I'd say that would be something that would be more germane. But even the Secretary of Treasury is smart enough to know you don't talk about the markets because every day that they're up, there's another day that they're down. And so now what do you say? I just assumed this was a really raucous hearing, and it was out of control by any stretch of the imagination. And I think this was her lifeline. When in doubt, if things turn bad and this thing really is a disaster, which is where it was, start talking about the stock market because nobody's going to ask you a question about that.
Wow. Okay. So how did she do? It seems like this administration's trying really hard to completely just revamp the way that hearings are conducted. You spent enough time on Capitol Hill. Usually it's grandstanding by lawmakers, and we film ads and use that tape. Now it's about the witness who shows up with Oppo research and tries to upstage the people who are running the panel. Is this the new way it works on Capitol Hill?
It's the witness but the witness with an audience of one.
Okay.
If you're looking at her, she knows that the president is watching what she's saying.
So he loved Dow 50,000.
He loves to talk about the stock market when it's good. You know, he doesn't like to talk, you know. But that is what that says to me. She is speaking to that one man. She wants to keep her job and she wants to stay in line. Not that it makes any sense. No, of course, that had nothing to do with the victims.
Well, and as she speaks to the one man, that one man sometimes speaks to her publicly, whether it's intended or not, as to what he'd like to see from her in terms of indictments coming from the DOJ. We know that the DOJ sought indictments for the 6 Democratic lawmakers who filmed that video on not following unlawful orders. If you're a member of the military, the grand jury did not give it to them. What has any of this accomplished, Kristen, other than raising the profile of those very Democrats?
I mean, I think it's done a lot to raise the profile, particularly of Mark Kelly. Right, and he's raised a lot of money, you know, in a lot of different ways, but in part because of this. So, you know, I'm not sure the president's thinking quite clearly about this, but you're not just looking at this federal indictment. There are a lot of them that haven't come to pass, and it's pretty remarkable. So I'm not sure that the president's really thinking through all of this.
Seditious 6 is how Pete Hegseth labeled these 6 veterans.
Right.
We've got about a minute left here. Rick Davis, you've worked closely with the military over your years in Washington, D.C. Mark Kelly's not out of the woods yet. Does he need to worry about some sort of prosecution by the Pentagon?
I wouldn't actually say he needs to worry about it. I actually agree with Kristen. I think the best thing that's happened to Mark Kelly's political career is this prosecution, or attempted prosecution, I should say, since it's obviously failed. And Pete Hegseth may try to stir the pot within the Joint Chiefs, but at the end of the day, he's really playing a very dangerous game with a real American hero, a fighter pilot, an astronaut. I mean, like, what's not to like? I mean, I wish he were a Republican and be perfect. But the reality is elevating Kelly's, stature.
All right, Rick Davis and Kristen Hahn, our political panel this evening. Thank you so much. And for more, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.